it so that the state is not committing further atrocities. There's no impact. Sorry,
so no uniqueness then.
no uniqueness to anything. And case always extend that gangs create a state of exception in Mexico, reordering citizen to subject relation to power. The constant fear of the bullet is one that justifies the distinction between Zoe and bio and makes precondition for killing populace. This has two implications. One, this biopolitical control fuels necropolitics where citizens power over life and death at the mercy of non-state actors living in constant fear of this being a form of dehumanization concept of living death in which Mexican citizens are the homo sucker and disposability violence of broken evidence, borders evidence. And the second is that absent the interrogation of the way that community gang violence, the enemy becomes elusive and inhumane form constitutes standing in a denial of humanity to pregnant the fear of an elusive other. That's our North 2K evidence. That makes any kind of violence against things like the environment inevitable. And this spills over across the border means that we still have two systemic impacts. It looks conceded in the one at the end only directly strengthening community institutions prevents against social disorganization. It indicates that reconstructing the bond between the population and the state starts with deterrence of youth from gang activities. That creates a precondition for this by providing for things like job creation and drug rehabilitation programs. That's key to create a community culture that's fostered by community institutions. Our Hagedorn evidence indicates that that's key to resolving the way that structural violence happens in the Mexican establishment with these. Yeah, okay, and don't forget stuff. One permutation do both and death imagery affirms life. Fox 85. We must make the request of something about the corporate method of bring self to us, so we must pull the we will find something to death rather than calling for action to do so we have the warning to fragile we know human and suffering and inevitable extreme suffering destroys the capacity of the stuff causing and justifying pain, which should be rejected at class 6. Miles from the mass production and meaning of the raise the sub the excess capacity of the shopping is what you could hold is no longer possible to meet the suffocating capacity of the license suffering is an absurdity just because the extreme suffering of the legitimizes death and the supporting the and his entirety and decision and identity by the totality meaning for nothing she operates capacity for metaphysical question of Israel and permutation do the alternative and the alternative itself standing fictification and maintains the same resentment against the insufficiency they criticize turns critique mentality 95. Nietzsche sends the journals and return paradox the current amount of journalists supplement the return of the journal because being called within their own devices, the purpose of knowledge and intelligence maintains external and normal specific discipline the office with an interpretation into perceptual power, production to sustain human experience, legitimate intelligence 30, the intellectuals of genius not only personalized power but also disembodied effort, and the alternative is the ivory tower elitism and dooms population systemic and last mom 94. Nietzsche's prayer results will find their human imagery, their intuitive comment of boost off these tell to last or another. He does rest to the movement of the day, and this wicked does not matter how much you live from it. Data life, this sort of the only the picture and playable enough with the deprivation of research, so central human function, each of us is the first. And this is representative of serial failure to make accurate decisions based on a bankroll calculus that prioritizes by real violence. We must create ethical decision making first. Cause Rachel one. Victims having at least of their understanding the ability state also looking at morals but national security state separates because of the Osman structure government supporting unethical legal practicality of these groups. It's not to mistake individual and physical harms citizens might or they're aware of its extent of protection opposition as the work of radicals disconnect with reality, market at reality and perm to the plant. And forgetting is a form of whitewashing that sanctifies the violence atrocities committed by the U.S. This makes the reproduction of violence against Mexico inevitable. Beauchard 95. Forgetting part of the extermination memory history of the social, forgetting essential human extermination, forgetting is that still remain no longer exists now. Everyone knows, everybody's tremble in the bottom. The exterminate sign that will never raise has been in the midst of currently reproducing itself.
Put them at the bottom.
Oh, I did? Yeah. And this process of historical revisionism and buries and sanctifies power. Show 98. The riddle feature of the extension of the revision process that ensures individuals left divided in the hands of those who consider the Robert out of regime, burial, and go ahead. Affirmative value of the plan versus the impacts of the critique and further joining the one issue with the framework of the one issue, otherwise they move the entirety of the speech. I have conceded to systemic violence scenarios means that we get to prioritize either impacts first and permutation to both. Only politics can settle the question of the values under their alternative nihilist and refuses to need to still act in the face of value attorneys are really no nine. The problem is the risk over policy what claims the political matter, the historical abstract issue, the sophisticated, very critical, they must be given use for us to lead partly for the breakdown of the capacity to judge criticism, the relevant policy to be opinion with them. Judgment can be adjusted with appeal with ethical criteria, but also the how we check the mental criteria, the judge critically and biology and thought make anthropocentric understanding inevitable. Word 90. Hopes 11 anthropocentric brains are further pressures of environment. Hopes anthropocentric German categories conservative superintendent employs such categories and
conceded the Nixon evidence.
Conceded the Nixon evidence.
Problematizing
all forms of structures of violence comes first. And
invisible violence.
Yeah. Makes invisible violence invisible. And all calls for viewing humans as natural beings, privileges, anthropocentric values, objectivity, and power, cover over overcoming anthropocentric humans as part of natural or detested within the health of land active, condemn anthropocentric humans, stand part of activity towards the view of evolution humans, overcoming the anthropocentric has been brought by development seen at the liberation of the anthropocentric values, and Necropolitics makes suffering inevitable where human agency can never be reclaimed through the process of dehumanized passivity. This is a dissent to their form of the alternative, and floating picture of Odomus to when see and unfair negative justifies permutation to us, and contradictory advocacies are bad. One, two, we see structural contradictions of the negative. Two, concede arguments on one float and short links to the other float makes it impossible to be asked to generate offense. Two, education contradictions to cool them, destroy argument interaction. A real world education policymaker cannot say they advocate bill and hate bill. Logical limited conditionalities, but the negative can have an infinite amount of conditional obviously absent contradictions. And yeah, I think.
Can you read the rash card?
And inclusion,
put it here.
Okay, put it on here. And inclusion necessitates exclusion, which is key to unveiling power relations. The critique strengthens gang structures and justifies continuous violence. That's rational 5. Community with such another assume that only the locus of the modern functionality difference exclusion may be multiple within modern inclusion regard exclusion being unavoidable and conditioned and malleable with dismay mind logical fact or the possible extent the condition for possible recognizing fellow human beings and thus legitimate political opponents acknowledge distinctions and those who are distinct by them simply go underground becoming invisible going more absolute violence and explosive force and even otherwise Anthro proves the reason to why we have to draw things like lines between enemies and friends. This is key to externalizing violence from populations which justifies further violence against things like animals. Necropolitics is the key way that we justify further animal violence against things like animals.
What does your shepherding news evidence indicate about the state and how the state interacts in, like, specifically Mexico politics?
Okay. Our shepherding news evidence just indicates that we have to prioritize the way structural violence is embedded into state structures. Things like gang violence that happens in Mexico is something that we often don't pay close enough attention to. And recognizing those micro-political structure of violence is key to addressing further macro.
Okay. So if there's like micro-political structures, things of that nature. Like, what does like the app do to solve things like state centricity? Like, what sort of like what do you stop?
Okay, people in Mexico are dying right now as a result of hyper-violence that happens. The app is a way of strengthening community institutions through things like rehabilitation programs, drug training. That's a form of death that should be avoidable, like either way.
Okay, can you explain this argument you make about how like your app is probably a prerequisite to solving like other things that are bad about the state? You said that you can think about other things later.
Right. Things like necropolitics are a way in which biopolitical relations make disposability of people inevitable. Things like that are only further replicated against animal beings and other forms of life. Our argument is that things like structural violence need to be prioritized so we can think about further levels of violence. I don't think they're exclusive from one another, rather it's just a prioritization argument.
Who should structural violence be prioritized for?
Because if it's true that, like, what do you mean?
Like who? Like
structural violence.
Our nation evidence indicates it's not a question of who, it's a question of it.
Structural violence.
Problematizing instances of structural violence means that we can break down the distinction between visible and invisible violence.
Structural violence happens to things like animals.
What do you mean?
Like, is there not
like slaughterhouses and stuff is probably structural violence. So we think the app presenting a form of structural violence is not necessarily incompatible. The inevitability of anthropocentrism just means that we should be able to do things like combat the way that humans are excluded and animals. There's no reason that those are mutually exclusive from one another. The thought is inevitable. You just can try to make the lines that distinguish between what?
Let's go to zero. You say that some suffering is somewhat inevitable, but extreme like identity loss causes us to sort of like lose ourselves.
Right. Not identity. This evidence just indicates that sure there are things like suffering representation is inevitable, suffering is inevitable, but extreme pain caused by things like decapitations and violence, something that destroys the subject in itself, which should be.
What pain do you experience?
What do you mean?
Like what pain do you experience right now?
Why do I have to feel experience?
I don't know. Do you feel like pain or anything?
I presented this one AC because I thought it was an important issue. I don't think I necessarily have to like stand here and like what I don't understand what
Does
you
it like
mean.
make? I mean,
Like,
what I'm asking is like.
It eviscerates an emotional response because I think this is important. I wrote this one AC, so.
Not necessarily. We have advocated like policy that problematizes structural violence. One, we think the policy is a good idea.
What's the goal at the like end of this round?
One, we think we should be able to advocate for the federal government doing things. Second, our next steps in case our discursive presentation was important.
I'm just gonna do it on my computer so I can type it in. Wait 7:25.
forgetting, and then Anthro.
On the cable contains permutation, they make an argument about death, imagery, key to affirming life's world, and one is number one on the Anthro debate proves why this is often expressed as the reason why we're able to affirm life of all inhuman animals as well as any sort of existence that is biotic. Life is, this is unique often expressed, and the reason why we get to leverage it against all their arguments about political engagement on the day. On the perfect debate, the role of the balanced use debate is a space for the practice of post-humanities as an operative displacement of debate that potential is inherent. The one you see this Damascus 10. So technically with problems related to control of life and death of the humans on one hand, and life on earth on the other, so operative everybody, means no question absolutely the earth can live conscious without humans. The challenge is to place research itself in the context of emerging critical technology, post-humanist displacement of art, and Jefferson, which displays human center of our studies, and their policy first frameworks, the link magnifier, they try to justify their interpretation or do some sort of good, but human species extend our kashi in order to get this sort of good life that they try to protect requires the subordination of genocide of all forms of life to not politically qualified means, and one sees it that to their interpretation, and also the political has already been ceded only a radical form of politics to regain it and regain it from transnational companies and political technophiles. positive facts, and 6. We live in an Preston era of social and ecological crisis. Transnational corporations are pillaging the planet. Profitable imperatives thrive in the exploitation against the mindless, optimism, technical, denial, skepticism, complacency of the public, reach far from the premise that the global environmental crisis, which is the most urgent issue facing us today, that humanity does not address the ecological problems immediately with the radical measures, while altering consequences will play a word losing ground in the battle to preserve the species, ecosystems, wilderness calls for moderation, compromise, and slow march through the institution can be seen as structures inadequate. We must eliminate false hopes which blind us from real possibilities. The current system is inherently structured but cannot be reformed. It must be transcended through revolution at all levels. That answers their permutation argument on the they say biology and anthropocentrism are inevitable. They say biology and anthropocentrism is inevitable, but there's no reason why the alternatives are the most desirable in a world in which we recognize the inevitability of anthropocentrism. That does not make it less ethical. That argument would preclude any ethical action forever being taken to allow the ethical contradiction of some unrelated action just because the reason to become a reason not to do it, not to do an ethical action doesn't make sense because they're all because then you're just affording a chance of doing something good by logic. Total passivity is the only answer, and on the link debate, their Norris 2K evidence is going to win us this debate round. It says that making the enemy into something inhuman, one fights then not to preserve one's own form of existence, but to rid the human world of the inhuman. To render war is into an act of purification. This manner renders that one seek not only to defeat but to utterly destroy the enemy. If their argument on the link debate, their argument on the link turn is only that the state is inherently bad, but their impacts and errors are just extension of the original human, non-human divide. The only alternative can contest the result of forms of violence because their approach actively normalizes it instead. If the divide itself is what makes violence happen, then why would we engage in it? The argument is that we should reject it. That's caution 9. This human father central data of the conception of relative value of the forms of life playing through the history or part of the value of life of their extension. The original human animal extinction regimes of violence have been seen to normalize in a manner that replicates the normalization of violence against the non-human animals. They make an argument about the invisibility of violence, but they conceded or Reynolds 12 evidence that violence is already inevitable, and it has nothing to do with whether or not we recognize state violence in Mexico. That argument is asinine. There are factory farms all across the world that exploit inhuman animals for our pleasure and our benefits. Just because we recognize state violence in Mexico doesn't mean that we stop killing millions of pregnant, we stop imprisoning millions of pregnant pigs every year, or millions of sheep transported, live transport of sheep across the world every year. The argument that we should just recognize the divide between what makes you politically qualified and not is what our Cauchy Ordin and Cauchy Ordin evidence is a giant critique of. The 2AC messed up here, not having a defense of why that is a proper political framework. They've also conceded that there's no intrinsic value, there's no extrinsic value to the human. At root, the desirability of the permanent consequence for the resolution of potential mass suffering and death. Our argument is supposed to be advocacy of the plan to achieve that goal because the entire project of human survival is built upon an endless domination of imposition of suffering of all the forms of life, meaning in that short term they prevent the suffering and death of the nuclear conflict in the name of some violence in Mexico, in the name of preserving a species which practices endless domination and suffering around the world. This is the reason why the alternative can solve the affirmative, but the affirmative cannot solve our impacts because they simply deny the validity of our impacts to begin with. That's also a reason why there's not necessarily a link of omission, but a link of commission because they're an active support of a system in which creates that genocide. Also, they support the state in creating that divide to begin with, which is the precondition for oppression. The 1ECU is pretty clever in making some arguments about Agave, but then they just made a terrible spin and went for some Schmidt arguments. And that means there's only some Schmittian arguments about the divide in the state, which only magnifies our impacts about what is deemed politically qualified. And they conceded. Also, they make an argument about why necropolitics is critical to solve, but they conceded that the alternative engaging in a species being allows us to recognize what it's like to experience that state violence from a perspective of infinity and recognizing it on a level of multiplicity. They make an argument about floating pigs or not floating pigs. They say that inclusion leads to exclusion, but they conceded that it's the ability to create that divide which allows for it to occur by creating a conceptual limit on the notion of humanity. Whole populations are rendered exterminable. The figure of the non-human becomes necessary as a negative mirror of the celebrated signifier of humanity. Enlightened principles of rationality and political intelligibility and inclusion become naturalized criteria for ethical relevance in our politics. That means we systematically exclude the undecided forms of life, non-human experience for our politics. This condemns the non-human others to endless genocide. That was the Cauchy Ordin natives and the K-turns case. Anthropocentrism communication attempt to minimize violence fail. Like confronting the Anthropocentrism Foundation, the ordering of violence can solve its card 6. What's this company embarking the investigation natural of the political violence concerned with the individual facing death, persecution, and percentage focus fails to get the grip of the issues raised with the destruction of objects and relates to secondary supplements of the individual subjects, and percentage understanding can lead to the enactment of political solutions that perpetuate the politics exclusion, i.e. the fact that they just normalize that state violence to begin with and deny the potential for resistance and refusal of extinction in the name of refusal of the genocide of the politically qualified life in the name of humanism and inclusion, abandon the incommunicable forms of life. The only ethical movements which we refuse to abandon bare life. That's noise and 10, noise and 7. The only request about the class and our strength and the power of the health and the verge of death, but power over constantly tries to do is break from the connection between the living and the speaking between. I study bare life as a rival ethics refuses to exclude bare life by the bears witness with the disjunction between the living being and the speaking belong. This is also another disadd to the permutation because the ability to decide what is communicable as your level for engagement denies any sort of pulse measure. Also, the argument about value judgments is a link, even if I didn't have one off the 1AC, I only politics can solve if you create ethical value judgments as a notion of humanity which denies the ability for the inhuman to construct a value in which we can interpret it as potential for resistance. They will always inevitably exclude that body from the polis. And the democratic liberal form of the affirmative and the permutation are a secret extension of the anthropocentric and machines injunction to the form of human animal distinction through the imposition to decide only to refuse the affirmative in favor of the creation of non-essential thinking of being souls. That's color code 6. But false manifest self-utilitarian and democratic form contains the possibility of concentration camps and meaning producing controlling bare life. It isn't that humanism guards against the war success of totalitarianism. There is a solidarity between democracy and totalitarianism at a historical and philosophical level. They are united in their investigation into the politics of the anthropocentric machine to separate bare life from the properly politically qualified. Even in democratic regimes maintain safeguard. Also, cut the guard here. Also, just gut check on a historical note. The idea that violence against Mexico or the inclusion between what is and isn't politically qualified doesn't just the affirmative obviously wouldn't solve that. Even if their politics are correct, the affirmative merely engages in a regurgitation of that divide. If there's a risk that their historical analysis of what actually creates violence is true, then you vote negative for rejecting the divide to begin with. On the alternative, our alternative is to reject the affirmative human survival ethic in favor of species being. The total abandonment of human survival ethic enables for a transformative thinking towards identity outside of species. Only total abandonment of the privileged species notion of human sexual survival can we reach an understanding of species being that entails a radical rejection of the political or ethical framework which is built upon the foundation of exclusion and communicable forms of life, allowing for our bodies to become terrorists against the system that allows for that violence to occur, allows for the best form of becoming.
How does the alternative in any way engage in the way that animals are constructed or species violence? If the alternative is to reject the affirmative, in what way does that engage that dichotomy?
Okay, yeah, so alternative is rejecting the notion of human survival or the notion of human ethics.
Okay, wait, why is human survival bad? Can I just get that real quick?
Well, human survival or the notion that we should stop human suffering is inevitably a framework that is built on an exclusive, not inclusive framework.
Okay, and how do you change that?
By engaging in a species being in which we recognize our lives and our understandings. Like,
how does that change with the violence that happens to people every day?
Like every day?
In what way does that materialize into concrete political action?
Well, our argument is that the notion of concrete political action is a link. Like, we should exist
so it's
outside of
that
that.
To be linked?
We should exist outside of that frame of reference.
Okay.
And we should reject
let's talk
that
about,
paradigm.
Okay, let's talk about your role of the ballot. This evidence indicates a world in which the world can correct the forms of violence that happen from people to people. How does any form of species dichotomization result in the way that humans violently exclude one another?
Okay, yeah, so the card we read at the top on our best 6 card talks about the way in which corporations or institutions justify violence against the ecological other forms of life as a means of expansion or development.
Right.
Our argument is that we need a total radical reshifting of our orientation to that, because no matter how much we reorient our ethics, I.e. saying suffering for the Mexican people, people in Mexico suffering.
Let's talk about that structurally. This evidence just
ourselves.
indicates that the species divide is one that constitutes things like Orientalist violence. Why is that true in the context of where it's just regular people on people?
Like people on people violence?
Yeah, because this evidence is citing things like anti-Semitism, which is not.
Well, no, let's talk about that. Like, things like anti-Semitism manifest themselves through anthropocentric tropes and justifications.
Right,
The fact that, I know. But if you're making arguments about the historical context of person-to-person violence justified by anthropocentrism,
Real quick,
we can look at
what's
things
the exclusivity argument about why preserving the alternative and still doing the app?
Well, the two are just functionally opposites. We should reaffirm the state. You say we should reaffirm the state and the binary between what is politically and not politically qualified.
Why is that incompatible with the alternative?
Because the alternative says we should.
There, but why is that incompatible with
The alternative is a rejection of the notion of inclusive-exclusive. It's a rejection of the human survival ethic.
What's the impact to?
Unending subordination of all life deemed politically not qualified.
Okay, the political argument then makes the argument that things like relegating yourself to questions about species divide inevitably allow things like corporation.
No, that's not what the evidence says. This evidence says that when we refuse to analyze those situations of anthropocentric violence, then they become possible.
when we don't recognize the ecosystem as something of equal value or life, really it's just a resource that we might need to preserve sometimes, that makes that violence justifiable.
It's gonna be condo, wherever you put that. I believe it was originally
Alright, so it's gonna be conditionality.
Yeah, conditionality in the case.
Wow,
You have a lot of things to
conditionality.
say about
No, it's like
conditionality.
everyone's just bigger.
I'm ready for this.
I cared about.
Vote nay on conditionality.
Don't
Yeah.
doubt Mike.
It's gonna be the first time.
Condo solvency based, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Conditionality is not a voting issue or interpretation of negative. It's two unconditional advocacies. First, negative flexibility. A diversity of approach key to debate, affirmative and way to avoid statements to encourage that diversity of approach to counter advocacies with courage, in-depth and ever-growing research. And the B point of decision-making skills learning with arguments are the best under the stress of debate and choosing between the multiple approaches is best. And two is critical thinking. Hard to debate, better debate. Forcing the two is to read their best offense to learn how arguments interact with decision-making skills. If we win, then it makes a debate harder because impossible. Then you vote negative. And the three is ideological flexibility. Negative could never have it. It's something new. If we thought that we're stuck in the no matter what conditionality ensures we're taking. And the fourth point, marketing target could be an unpredictable key to affirmative debatability. You should be good and not ground the key to thinking already critical forces. The affirmative to how read their best offense. And advocacy skills, which side means that everyone goes after the role. The affirmative is a team to learn their advocacy skills. Two implications. A is real world. Obama has to defend his position against the Tea Party and a bunch of communists. The next, that he should be able to test the affirmative at the same level of depth. And the B point is negative theory. We should be able to, we just have to win the affirmative is bad, multiple approach to do that. You contradict ourselves all we want. And 6 is hold them to end round abuse, potential abuse isn't a voter issue. 7, don't force to a strategy of contradiction or our fault, and don't hold responsible because they don't know how to debate. And 8 is skew is inevitable. The 8 point under some debaters are always passionate. The B point is negative, gets blocked, and time skew is inevitable. We get 30 minutes to read new arguments. And the C one under happens in any one. The best links turn to the DAs or links to other arguments. And the 9 point is education outweighs fairness. When we learn about debate, its lasting effect on our lives, one law shouldn't shape your decision. And 10 is the same as exploring multiple perspectives shows your performative pedagogy. Your failure to do so leads to repetition of Bina and Perry and Love. Looking at new perspective of our interpretation of the student-led learning moments emerging the influence of nomadic and the help to understand the new policies of hours we receive the information at a diverse form of continuation. The inquiry becomes our more relevant state. Go to state. We're going to start out with the will to start. But first is a straight turn. I want to see what you put evidence indicates that the abs romanticism and institutional democratic tradition as a method to reduce political action of all else called anti-political ignores the history and mutual relationship between democracy and increased incorporation of cultural, which causes anti-political black terror. All the two the answers here miss the point and merely try to reassert arguments about how they can somehow prioritize a bunch of these arguments. But the app has it backwards. The C is radical in favor of the notion of this civil science and political is a true failure. Straight turns the whole argument. Vote independently here. This is Baruch and Zupancic.
above the criticism, more radical left position of rejecting the critical political system overpowered government, conservative radical voice to consider the shape of the agenda, focusing political establishment and much as well of the changeable political effect. The current crisis of the left was not caused by seeing the political quite opposite of they focus on pragmatic, centristic approaches and all of their attempts coming out of the 2AC attempting to account for black identity in some sort of priority establishment when things like their Schefter Hughes evidence remain caught up in the discourse of works of like things like hegemony. This discounts the positive this discounts the positive positionality and idleness replicating violence against the black subject is Wilderson in theory. Any missing antagonist identity formation of the grips of the contradiction between political dependence on radical social movements and the ideological structure and the right political desire, positionality, black subjectivity, the heart of the contradiction of the unspoken desire is the ground of political ramification of the hate or radical social movement that embraces the anti-reproduction of anti-black politics nonetheless represent itself the black American subject in both the radical incoherence of the subject logic today in coalition the black subject reveals the inability of social movements to substitute of white supremacy in the base of thereby calling the question of their elaborate comprehensive of antagonism and scandal. The black subject opposes the threat of division of discourse and the whole mode of political engagement is focused on the balance capacity of meaning and action. Capacity itself is a hallmark right is to praise the incapacity of black body. There are arguments that we should prioritize and split our identity somehow. I'll get to more of these state arguments in a second, but let me get to this first thing. Like the plan, whatever they should say, it should probably come first as a critical link in our Wilderson evidence. This Wilderson indicates in the liberal economy on our journey to achieve the structure of our understanding exchange of the way the ontology, the blackness under overturning the embodiment and impossibility, the political, economic, and symbolic, and the capacity of state on a precognitive way. Laws of Portugal, the intelligibility of whiteness, monumentalized subject capacity, cut the cardinal capacity, and any analysis policy making that proceeds from the state cannot provide resources of articulate capacity of human agency. That's our bleaker 2K evidence that indicates that things can't really get done because representations are crucial importance and things like stationtricity and that things aren't going to get adequately correctly. They prove this argument when they read their Schefter Hughes evidence and extend to multiple pieces of our offense, trying to say that we should prioritize and we can think about these things later. But that is the exact thing that the state wants. And state centricity leads to violent exclusion of other viewpoints means that there is no spillover claims to the 1AC to their community. International theories of international structures focus on the declare this is an agency and neither main focus on the north starting for the privilege of authority in the state of adequate understanding of the radical penetration of the current field. State-centric approaches on the legitimization and state centricity leads to monopoly of education that silences viewpoints. It turns all their community that you want to create some inside the plan this as well as it is powerful to hold the notion of state and intellectual set of being on state centricity international emergence and also decide the ability of scholars to understand the view and middle of global.
653.
Yeah.